Okay, welcome back. We're going to continue on with our abdominopelvic cavity, and we're going to move on to the intestinal tract and talk about the small intestine and the large intestine and the different divisions of those that you need to know, which are provided to you on your anatomy study guide. So I have a different view here of the abdominopelvic cavity, and we're going to zoom in here toward our large and small intestine. I'm going to highlight this yellowish brown structure here first. That's called the greater omentum. Now, it's not actually listed on your anatomy study guide, but I just wanted to point that out to you because in case you're seeing that on diagrams in the book or other things that you may be using as your anatomy resource. That is actually like a double fold of the parietal peritoneum, that serous membrane that lines the abdominopelvic cavity, and it has some fatty tissue included in there as well. So it's a covering around the anterior side of the large and the small intestine. So I'm going to hide that so we can zoom in closer on the intestinal tract. All right, so in pink here, the wiggly, thinner structure that you see, that's the small intestine. And then the large intestine, even though if you actually compared the length of the large intestine to the length of the small intestine, it would be shorter. The small intestine is much longer, many feet long. It's just all wadded up there inside your abdominopelvic cavity. Large intestine is called the large intestine because it's wider than the small intestine. All right, so that we can zoom in on, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to hide this part up here of the colon and leave the rest of it in place. And so now I've exposed the entire small intestine here. And the small intestine is divided up into 3 sections. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight the first section for you. Everything you see there in blue, move down a little bit, is the first section of the small intestine. That's called the duodenum or the duodenum. And you can see that's the portion that's connected to the stomach. So as you swallow food and beverages down your esophagus, they enter the stomach. They begin to undergo some of the processes of digestion in the stomach, but then they move from there into this first segment of the small intestine called the duodenum or the duodenum. And the duodenum here is connected to the gallbladder, as you'll learn about. We just mentioned on the last video clip that the gallbladder makes bile, which helps you digest your fats. And also this little brownish structure you see here behind the stomach, that's the pancreas. So this section of the small intestine is connected to that as well. And the pancreas makes many, many digestive enzymes that help you digest your food. And most people before they take an anatomy course, they may think the stomach is where most of your food gets digested, and that's not really the case. Some of the processes begin there, but you'll learn in Biology 202 that the majority of the digestion of your food actually takes place in the small intestine, and especially in the first couple of sections there. All right, so I'm going to deselect that. The second stretch of the small intestine, let me zoom out, move this up a little bit. So everything you see there highlighted in blue is called the jejunum. That's the second section of the small intestine. And let me highlight the third section. This is called the ileum. And notice in your study guide that is spelled, or up here on the screen, I-L-E-U-M, ileum. And the reason I'm pointing that out to you is, let me deselect that. If I highlight that part of the right pelvic bone and this part of the left pelvic bone over here and look up here on the top of the screen, those sections of the pelvic bones are also called the ilium on each side, but notice it is spelled I-L-I-U-M. So unfortunately, I think those anatomists, early anatomists, who named all these things were maybe a little bit sadistic and twisted, so they gave things similar names with different spellings just to torture us. So spelling is important in anatomy, and especially in cases like this, you want to be careful about how you're spelling things because it could mean 2 completely different things. Easy way to remember it is the ileum with an E, and E looks kind of squiggly, and the small intestine looks kind of squiggly, so that's a good way to remember that. All right, now don't stress over where along the small intestine you have your borders between the duodenum or duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. But you should know the order in which foods and beverages that you're digesting and absorbing pass through that. So first it's the duodenum, then they move into the jejunum, and finally that third section is the ileum. And on a test question, I'm going to have to, I may have an arrow pointing to the small intestine, and I might say, hey, name this third section of the small intestine, and then you would know to call that the ileum. So you just have to read the test questions carefully. Okay, that's our small intestine. Let me bring everything back up over here. I'm going to have to get rid of my greater omentum again. So now let's talk about the large intestine, this thicker tube that we have in the abdominopelvic cavity. All right, so the small intestine is the location where you really fully digest your foods. You absorb most of the valuable nutrients. And so really what you have at the end of the small intestine here, at the end of the ileum, by now you really just have wastes, things that you can't digest. Your feces are beginning to form. And so all of that stuff is going to move into the large intestine as it continues its journey out of the body. Now the walls of your small and large intestines are muscular, so they contract to squeeze things, propel things forward, almost like when you squeeze a tube of toothpaste. So your digestive waste is entering this first section of the large intestine here. I'm going to turn on my pen here. Hopefully this will cooperate. All right, this is not in your lab guide, or your study guide, but I do want to point out for you this first section of the large intestine where it's wider is called the cecum, because you may see that on diagrams, or if you're using some other type of anatomy application, don't be surprised if you see that. Okay, so that first little section there is called the cecum, and moving on then from there. Okay, let me escape from here one more time. I'm going to come back, and I want to zoom in for you over here. Notice this little appendage here, kind of looks like a rat tail. Let me get my pen on here. That little structure there, here, let me get my highlighter on so it'll show up a little bit better for you. Kind of looks like a little tail hanging off of that very first part of the large intestine. That is your appendix, or vermiform appendix. And so that's where that's located. So you guys, you do want to be able to identify that if you see it on a test question. So that's where that's located, not all that impressive. Now what happens is you have a lot of bacteria in your, let me get out of my pen mode here. You have a lot of bacteria that are located up here in the large intestine, and if that appendix becomes inflamed, it can rupture, and those bacteria spill out of there, and they enter into the abdominopelvic cavity, and that's bad news. You're not supposed to have bacteria in your abdominopelvic cavity, because then they have access to all these important organs in here where they're not supposed to be, and that can actually kill you if you don't get it treated pretty quickly. All right, then how about the rest of our large intestine here? It's divided up into sections that you guys should know, and I'm going to turn my pen on and go through these different sections. So thinking about the way that foods would move through your large intestine, so they come in from the ileum there, and then they, let me change my pen color. They enter that little area called the cecum, and then they start getting squeezed upward over here on the right side of the body. So that area is called the ascending colon. and then they make a turn here, and they get squeezed across this way. And these are your feces that are developing in the colon, and that part of the colon is called the transverse colon, which makes sense if you think about a transverse plane running across the body. That's why that's named that. Then you have a stretch of colon over here on the left-hand side where it's moving down, and that is called the descending colon. Okay, and then your colon makes an S-shaped curve, and that is actually called right there, that's called your sigmoid colon. Maybe you've heard of somebody having a sigmoidoscopy before. That's where they send a little visual device up into the colon to check out that region. Maybe they're looking for colon cancer, polyps, things like that, other abnormalities that might be there. Okay, so let me get out of my drawing here. So you've got the feces that are forming, move upward, up the ascending colon, across the transverse, down the descending, then they snake through here on the sigmoid colon. I'm going to kind of rotate this and zoom in so you can see that S shape of that part of the colon a little bit better. So it does takes a little curvy route there on its way toward the exit from the body. Move this up. All right, then you have the last section of the colon is called the rectum. And then finally, the opening, let me deselect the rectum there. This opening here to the outside is called the anus, or the anal canal, that very last little section there. Okay, so that's your entire intestinal tract and all the different parts. It does help if you learn the order that things would pass through your digestive system from one end to the other. It helps you keep all of these different structures and structures straight. I'm not going to ask you that on a test, but it is the pathways they're very helpful for learning both the anatomy and then also later the function that these different things have. All right, I'm going to stop this video clip here, and then the last one will cover the remaining structures of the abdominopelvic cavity, and also we'll briefly cover the features of the lymphatic system that you need to know from Unit 1.